Thank you, Braden, and thank you all. I'm so delighted to be here. This is a wonderful occasion. The talk I gave in Miami about a month ago was about love and friendship in Hamlet, and it positions Hamlet more or less right in the midst of Shakespeare's career. He wrote it about 1599, 1600. That turns out to be a very convenient and sort of schematic date. He was then 35 or 36. He had been in London for about a decade, and during that first decade of the 1590s, he wrote mainly English history plays and romantic comedies. That's not entirely the limit of that. There were two tragedies, Titus Andronicus and also Romeo and Juliet. But Romeo actually fits very well in this story too, because it's also about romantic love. The first half of the play is actually a delightful comedy, I think, as he ever wrote. And generally speaking, the picture of love and friendship in these early romantic plays is one in which love is very upbeat. It's about young men meeting young women, and it tends to end with a parade to the altar, and in which the situation is seen as very, very happily resolved after the complications, difficulties one encounters in Love's Labour's Lost or the Midsummer Night's Dream and so on. It's fun to include Romeo and Juliet because though the tragedy is a terrific love story, none greater, of course. I was reminded of an article I read in one of the London papers a number of years ago, in which a headmistress of a young woman's academy somewhere close to London made the decision not to take her charges to go see Romeo and Juliet, a production in London, because, as she put it, the play is so resolutely heterosexual. I'm not sure she's right about that, as a matter of fact, but it was because of all the cross-dressing that we want to talk about. But it does bring up the sense in which Romeo and Juliet belongs to this same pattern, that it's the great love story with all the difficulties. The difficulties are external. The young man and the young woman are deeply fond of each other, and of course this one ends in death. It is certainly a love story, if ever was a love story. In general, in this picture, the young women are self-possessed. They know who they are, they know where they're going, they know who they want to marry, and the gentlemen are all over the map. They don't know who they are. They're so insecure, really, and they need to be taken in hand by the young women. That's especially true, as you like it, in Twelfth Night, where Rosalind and Viola take on the young men that they're deeply interested in and love with, really, and in a wonderful series of meetings and so on, especially Rosalind, and As You Like It, tries to straighten out young Orlando in terms of how to be aiming at a kind of mature relationship that will be a lasting one, that is not surrounded by all sorts of false ideas about courtship from the Petrarchan sonnet tradition. So that's a very happy picture by and large, whereas in the plays that follow Hamlet, and beginning with Hamlet, everything becomes so much more problematic, and it does so with love and friendship. In Hamlet, obviously, we encounter Hamlet's failed relationship with Ophelia, and then his difficulties with his mother. I think it can be argued that he recovers some of his attachment to his mother and his revulsion at her behavior, her rapid marriage to a hated uncle after the death of Hamlet's father, which Hamlet, of course, knows also was a murder. So that's deeply fraught with all sorts of complications of that relationship that are basically sort of Oedipal, in the sense that Freud uses that term. So what is that's happening to love and friendship? And part of my argument is and was that friendship takes on a much more important role, really kind of a displacing and replacing role for the love which seems no longer to be inadequate or solid or reliable from the point of view of the protagonist, or indeed I think from us as we're watching or listening or reading to the play, so that we move on to a situation in which friendship becomes so much more important. Now, obviously the important friendship in these terms is that of Hamlet and Horatio. Even here, friendship is problematized in the play because the friendship of Hamlet with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern is a difficult one. They're old friends. He's so happy to see them when they turn up. He's lonely, and he remembers them with fondness, and it starts off very warmly, but it doesn't take very long for him to figure out that they were sent for by the king. They're not to their credit, they are not practiced liars, and so they accept finally that they have to confess to him that they were sent for. Now, even that is not something that's blameworthy, at least on the surface. We can understand why. If when we're called today to go down to Washington and look after somebody who's proving to be a difficulty in the White House and so on, and the president doesn't know what to do about this, and you're an old friend, and you could take a look at that person and try to figure out what's bothering and convey that information to the president and so on. You'd accept that assignment, I think, with alacrity and with a sense of pride of having been asked. As Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are a very similar situation. What they don't know, of course, is that Claudius has killed his brother to be able to become king and has married his brother's widow. But on terms of what they know, their behavior is perfectly plausible. On the other hand, as soon as Hamlet discovers that they were sent for, and it gets worse and worse in the play and so on, that they are concerned about his behavior when he behaves erratically to try to put the king off his guard, but with the mad behavior that Hamlet adopts for himself, that they become more and more unhappy with Hamlet's behavior. They're then sent, of course, assigned with the role of carrying him off to England. And it's unbeknownst to them, but of course their assignment, a secret assignment, is to turn him over to the king, who will then carry out an execution. That doesn't happen, of course, because Hamlet outwits them and returns to Denmark. But that's a nice sort of paradigm of a failed friendship. And then also what Polonius says to his daughter in the first scene, we see Polonius with Laertes and Ophelia, when Laertes is about to go off to Paris, that among other things that Polonius talks about in terms of advice to his son, how to get on with the world and so on. He says, those friends thou hast in their adoption tried, grappled into thy soul with hoops of steel. And he goes on, but don't have too many other companions and so on. You should really have one, at most two friends, and cherish them and be confident with them. And that sounds like good advice. It even sounds like Hamlet's relationship to Horatio, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. On the other hand, his advice in general is put in terms of self-interest, of prudence, of how to get on, how to influence people, how to get on in this world and be a successful courtier and not get in trouble, and how to behave yourself in Paris and have fun but not see too many people, and how to wear the right clothes and so on, so that he too fails as a friend. And Shakespeare loves this way of setting up model, doesn't he, in these plays of characters who were to be compared with one another. And one sees that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern and Polonius's model of what a good friend might be are set off against Hamlet's. And Hamlet's, this is interesting with Horatio, isn't it? They're fellow students of a somewhat more advanced age, because he's a crown prince, been waiting to wonder what's going to happen to him when his father dies. He's off studying at Wittenberg, interesting name associated with the Protestant Reformation. And the two of them study, they're not taking courses or anything, they're just there reading and exploring. When their friendship, we gather, their friendship is one of really exchanging ideas with one another. They love to talk. They disagree because Horatio is more of a skeptic and a scientist. Hamlet understands that, but he loves the fact that in fact they disagree, and they can, with completely unbuttoned conversation with one another. And Hamlet just can't find that anywhere else. And his most eloquent statement of this, of his love, it certainly is that for Horatio, is just before put on the play. Within the play, he's told Horatio that what he knows about the murder and so on. That's a sign of his great confidence, that he tells the secret that he tells to no one else, certainly not to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. That Horatio knows what's up, and he understands that the play within the play is a means of testing Claudius to see if he's guilty or not, and Hamlet wants to be there and take part in that. And as they're waiting for that moment to begin, Hamlet just turns to Horatio and says, "Horatio, thou art even as just a man as ever my conversation coped withal." And he explains this in terms of saying, you are a man who in suffering all suffers nothing, whose fortune's buffets and rewards has taken with equal thanks. He describes, in other words, a kind of a Roman Stoic who knows how to be indifferent to the rewards or the buffets of fortune, That's a nice definition, nice thumbnail definition of Stoicism, because it's not just being tough when the going gets tough, it's also understanding that you don't care whether fortune or benefit offers you benefits or not, because fortune is a goddess, she's a bitch goddess, she'll just take them away. Hamlet admires that so much in Horatio. He enjoys the passivity of his Stoicism. Hamlet has this task to try to decide what to do about his father's death and his commission to avenge that murder. He doesn't quite know how to sort out action and passivity and so on, but Horatio offers him a different kind of a model this way. And anyway, the main thing is that in Horatio, he understands that this is disinterested. This is a young man who has nothing to gain from being Hamlet's friends. When you're a crown prince, people come at you all the time, and you have to be careful who you're friends, because you're in a position of power, and people will want to know what they can gain possibly from you. It seems with Horatio that Hamlet senses, and we sense that clearly that's true, that Horatio just loves Hamlet as a wonderful man, and he was glad to exchange these conversations and so on. And Hamlet feels the same way, and they kind of equality, despite their presumed difference in rank, because he is the crown prince and so on, that this is the one person in the world with whom he can be completely frank and open and feel good about himself and good about this relationship. And he ends this little discussion before the play goes on by sort of leaning over to Horatio and saying, "No, something too much of this," which I take to mean that I'm sorry, I just embarrassed us by saying I love you. It's a difficult thing for men to say to each other and so on, but you understand. And let's go on and talk now about the play. So there is that lovely touching moment, and it leads forward to the end of the play where Hamlet dies in Horatio's arms, and Horatio, heartbroken, agrees to stay on living to tell Hamlet's story because that story needs to be told, but he would prefer to die with his dear friend and have done with this world. So that really is quite a wonderful, consoling picture of friendship, but it's a consolation in the sense of finding something that is not there in Hamlet's heterosexual encounters, and it goes on to the later plays too. King Lear is clearly one in which family relationships, a father and daughter, or Kent as a dear, loyal servant of King Lear and so on, is just disinterestedly wanting to help this wonderful man whom he admires as his king and his friend and so on. And in King Lear, it's obvious that heterosexual relationships don't get very far. The Goneril and Regan are such monstrous examples of that. And Cordelia is married to the King of France, but then she has to leave that to come home and save her father. So that problem remains, and Hamlet serves there as a kind of a pivoting figure right in the middle of Shakespeare's career when we start getting this turn.
Wonderful. So, David, you've provided a wonderful map of the talk you gave in Florida for those of our auditors who didn't hear it.
Right.
And it sets up several questions that I think we can pursue.
Wonderful.
Let me say, certainly you don't need any introduction to our participants. They know who you are. I'll say that I am David Bevington's colleague in the English department. I'm delighted to be here. David and I would like to encourage all participants to send in questions. And we will start the conversation by thinking a little further about some of the topics that David has just raised around love and friendship as themes in Shakespeare's career, and then we will move out from there to a more general conversation about Hamlet. So one thing, David, that you are suggesting in the paper and in your account of Hamlet is that there's a shift in Shakespeare's work from in which friendship becomes a substitute for erotic relation, specifically heterosexual relation, about which the later plays become more cynical. So that suggests to me two questions. And the first is whether you think that there is, in fact, the same kind of cynicism around friendship itself. That there is, whether the plays present a darker view of what friendship is or what friendship actually could become. So I think, for example, of a moment in the scene between Laertes and Polonius, where, not Laertes and Polonius, Polonius and his servant, the one
Right.
he's sending off to Laertes to trap his son.
Ronaldo. Right.
Ronaldo.
Right.
And he
Yes.
says to Ronaldo, he
Yes.
says something very odd. He says, the way you're going to do this is you're going to insinuate yourself
Yes.
into Laertes' life,
Right.
and the person you're speaking to might say, "Good sir, friend, gentleman."
Right.
And then Polonius, in his way, gets lost in his thought, and he has to be pulled back by Ronaldo.
Right.
But what do you make of the fact that friend there, as a
Yes,
term,
yes.
operates really exactly as the opposite of the kind of ideal friendship
Yes,
that you're
right,
describing?
right.
Their friend, curiously enough, is something like a marker of a stranger.
Yes,
It's a
right.
word that you use to do something socially, but
right.
that's quite different from the sort of ideal friendship you're describing.
Somebody I might be able to use, right?
Somebody you might be able to use. So
That's
how
right.
does
Yes.
your account of the
Yeah.
rise of friendship as an ideal go along
Right,
with the testing of this more cynical view of friendship?
That's wonderful. And, we could add to friend actually the word love.
Yes,
the
indeed.
way in which in Shakespeare's plays, I find my students are perplexed by this. When one man will say, "I love you so much," my love for you prompts me to want to offer to do this. And in many cases, it will be like, my love to you offers me to, can I offer you a cup of tea or something like that. It's
Yes.
something trivial, or indeed, as you say, much more interested and politically calculated. There's no question that both words, love and friendship, in the court of Queen Elizabeth, and no doubt more broadly on the continent in that period, was used to express this sense of, well, for one, it's part of flattering hyperbole, isn't it? Expressing, especially in such a gendered but also a stratified society socially, that one was constantly under a situation of what young people wanting to flatter a king by saying, "My love for you means that I will do." You get that in King Lear. There's a good example of that. Both Goneril and Regan say, "My love for you is such that I would be willing to die," and so on. And Cordelia has to come in and say, "What am I supposed to say then? Love and be silent." Really, so that's another model of this, that the perfect love might actually have to turn out to be wordless, because the word has lost its meaning. Lawrence Stone is very interesting in this regard, isn't it, Braden? That Lawrence Stone wrote a book about he's a historian, but he's one of the major historians, and one especially whom, and including yourself, the critics have used to very good purpose to see into these topics in terms of the social context of the Elizabethan period. And his argument is that friendships were indeed, on the whole, very brittle, and that people at court felt it was a struggle for survival, and that you had to watch out, and that you indulged just customarily and symptomatically in terms of this kind of hyperbolic overuse of these terms of demonstrating affection. So when that language has deteriorated to that extent, where is Shakespeare exploring this in terms of a play when I think that's exactly where Horatio comes in, that Hamlet finds in Horatio someone he just knows, that when Horatio says what he says, that he means it.
It's a wonderful point. I think so you're suggesting that we think of the play as being concerned partly with how it remains possible to express a bond or affection when the very words we use for those bonds have become slightly exhausted and emptied of their significance. So it's really that's a wonderful point. A second question that sort of came up for me in relation to what you've said about your recent talk is if you're thinking about the friendship between Horatio and Hamlet as occupying a different kind of place from the bonds of erotic love. What is the nature of friendship, do you think, that allows it to escape, to the extent it does, the kinds of pressures that make loves so unsatisfactory as a bond? And you've mentioned a few pointers, so let me call them up and ask you to reflect further on them. So is it possible to have friendships, for example, across boundaries of age or of generation?
Or gender.
And very crucially,
Right,
is
right.
it possible to have friendship
Right.
across
Yes.
gender boundaries?
That's beautiful.
What are the boundaries that
Yeah.
interfere with friendship? And is that one reason why friendship has a slightly different aspect in the play from
so.
those of erotic love?
I think so. That's beautiful. Thank you, Braden. Going back to the late comedies of the 1590s, I think is helpful in this regard, just to talk about exactly what you were describing there, how this can cross these boundaries. So take both As You Like It and Twelfth Night. I was suggesting before that the young men are really out of control, don't know who they are, and are very poor wooers, really, and very, very poor understanders of women and what it is that women want. So that Rosalind has to take Orlando in hand and tell him what that's about. And she says, you know, women are, if you marry your Rosalind, because she's pretending, of course, to be a young man and playing the role of the Rosalind whom he would marry, that Rosalind will be crossing your mood all the while. She'll be giddy when you're trying to be serious, and the reverse, and so on. She doesn't claim, of course, that the young woman would be inconstant, but she says you'll really have your hands full dealing with this person. The relationships are very complicated that way. What happens under the circumstances, I think, beautifully in both of those plays, at the end of Shakespeare's writing his wonderful, great romantic comedies, is that Shakespeare works out a solution, I think, describing exactly what you're talking about, Braden. If you think it from the point of view of the young male, and I'm thinking about Hamlet, Shakespeare himself in these terms, as a male writing about what it is to be involved in a let's say, a loving relationship or a series of loving relationships. Heterosexuality, or this young man meets young woman, the difficulties that he portrays, and it seems to me they're real enough indeed, are ones in which the misunderstandings are simply heightened almost beyond perspective by gender difference. You take Midsummer Night's Dream. They have four couples, they get mixed up in various combinations and so on, but out in the woods of Athens, they end up being so unhappy with themselves and feeling so betrayed and so outnumbered and despised by all the other members of the group and so on. You get a kind of little psychological picture of the kind of paranoia that goes with being a young person, how to figure out how to relate to somebody else who's of your same age, and let's take this heterosexual model, which is the important one there, how to deal with it, because that relationship has these difficulties of the huge barrier of gender difference, especially with young men not understanding what women are about, but find them utterly fascinating and unknowable, that you get involved in all these fantasies of not understanding what's going on. The paranoia just comes right back at you immediately, feeling that you're not being appreciated or understood. That we've all had that experience of falling in love and feeling it's such a wonderful experience when it works, and so fraught with difficulties when you feel that this. Let's take Much Ado About Nothing, perhaps as a perfect example of this. Both Beatrice and Benedict are attracted to each other, but they play a game of putting each other down, and they don't know whether it's real or not. And they do sort of games to test it, and it looks as though it is real. So they do their best to try to destroy that relationship by that sense of paranoia. So falling in love heterosexually is fraught with difficulties, as Shakespeare portrays it. Now, what happens in As You Like It and Twelfth Night, I think, is to get a kind of perfect solution is to the young woman, plays, of course, by a male actor, then disguises herself as a young man in order to be able to be a servant or a perfect friend. Viola in Twelfth Night takes on a service with the Duke Orsino, a social inferior of his, but one who immediately becomes a confidant and a offer of advice, and quickly about offering of advice about love. Now, again, my position here is that Duke Orsino doesn't know a thing about falling in love, but he's portrayed that way in the play, self-pitying and self-dramatizing, and kind of a basket case. But she loves him, and he has many redeeming qualities. So she's simply, in the guise of a male-to-male friendship, they are able to talk, from his point of view, frankly, about some things they wouldn't be able to deal with otherwise. And not only talk, of course, form a relationship, which is that is seemingly non-eroticized. I say seemingly because, of course, up right and back, it's this eros all over the place. But
in effect, they're able to fall in love because they are speaking within the bonds of friendship as well.
And Rosalind does the same thing with Orlando, right? So then, that's where theater magic works so well, because once, say, Rosalind has proved that point to Orlando, and he's completely at ease in terms of loving this imaginary person called Rosalind, all she has to do is to snap, presto, changeo, take off her disguise, and she is the Rosalind that he has learned to love in a mature way, right? So then the interesting question, why is it, having worked out this wonderful solution, why did we move into Hamlet with all these encountered difficulties? What I'm going to say about that this turning point in Shakespeare
May I point to a line that I think in Hamlet that speaks exactly to the thing you're describing? Because in Twelfth Night, that relationship between Cesario, Viola in her disguise, and Orsino is in one sense a relation with an equal relation in that it's a male-male friendship.
Right.
But in another, it's a relation of service.
Right.
So,
yes.
And the service relation is quite interesting. And I'm sure you've thought a lot about that moment in Act 1, Scene 2, when Horatio greets Hamlet and says, "Your good servant, sir." Right. And instantly Hamlet corrects him and says, "Sir, my good friend."
That's right.
My good friend. So there, the service relationship is measured against the friendship relation.
Right.
And I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you see that working, whether the hierarchy of the service relation is antagonistic towards friendship in the play, or whether it in fact is facilitates friendship.
Yeah, I guess I think it is a hazard. It's like heterosexuality. It's another one of these hurdles that young people have to learn how to cope with and get over to really be truly fond of one another. I think Hamlet plainly sees that as a difficulty. That's so nicely implicit in the lines that you're quoting. He makes that point of, please don't, can we somehow get over this difficulty that you're thinking of yourself as my servant? I know what you're talking about. Of course, we're from different social ranks, but the part of our life that we're really trying to share is one that has nothing to do with all this mucky-muck at court. So, which is the sort of thing that Hamlet hates. He talks about Denmark as an unweeded garden and things rank and gross, but says it merely, and he's talking about his mother's marriage and all that, but it's clearly more generalized to talk about the court of Claudius. And Claudius is this kind of guy who really he's a politician. He's a very good one. But it's in terms of you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. That's the relationship he has with Polonius. Well, all right, but Hamlet really, I think, despises that in a way I think we're invited to admire, even if we see it's rather otherworldly. But that's where Horatio comes in. He doesn't belong to that world of the court. We don't know what his standing is at court. It's never explored. Who is he? We don't even know what his social rank is. It's clearly below that, so that it's quite proper for him to say, I'm your servant, but which doesn't mean I'm in your service, I wear your livery, or you can give me orders or anything. He just means I'm below you in social ranking, you're the crown prince, and so it's quite proper for him to say that, right? That kind of relationship is very important for the junior, the one who's further down in the social scale, to defer and say, please don't let me presume. That turns up in Henry IV, Part 1, where you have Prince Poins with Prince Hal and so on. They keep exploring that thing. They start using, Hal is allowed to, Poins is allowed to use Hal's name, but even there you can see the princes being served. You're a little careful. You don't want to presume too much on a kind of familiarity. And with Falstaff, of course, even more prominently, you don't push this too hard that I'm allowing you to be my buddy. So, and that's about the same time, of course. Henry, the late 1590s, Shakespeare's exploring that in those history plays. So
the possibility of friendship across extreme divisions, social divisions.
That's right. Now, that's nice because that idea, of course, of love being able to conquer all ranks. Which Gilbert plays so nicely in Gilbert and Sullivan's Pinafore, for example. Never mind the why and wherefore, love can conquer ranks, and therefore that's a kind of cliche of romantic plotting. And you get it a lot in Renaissance plays, don't you? In Green's plays, for example, of Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay, where you have simultaneous marriage of the Prince of Wales with a lady of the court and so on the one hand, the fair maid of Fressingfield, who is a milkmaid who's going to marry the Earl of Lincoln. Well, for goodness sake, I mean, that's just a fatuous, but of course a pipe dream for Renaissance audiences or for anybody to think about, what's rank? Why shouldn't I just be able to be anybody I marry anybody I want to marry? Now, so that's a stuff of the comedy that can be overcome by the comedy's fantasizing that the love can conquer all ranks. Hamlet, dealing with a more serious world of tragedy and so on, confronts in Hamlet and Ophelia the problem that they can't marry very well, right? And again, Polonius is the one, but Laertes too, are the one who keeps saying to Ophelia, you've got to bear this in mind. You're below this man in social rank. I'm comparing this with the Horatio relationship to Hamlet.
And that Hamlet's love is not in effect his to give.
That's right, and Hamlet knows that too, but damn it, he doesn't want anything to do with that, of course. And then later on, it's very nice that Gertrude keeps saying, I wish thou couldst have been my Hamlet's wife. She has, again, because she's a woman, partly, isn't it mainly that, I guess, that she's obedient to her husband up to a point, but she doesn't want to live in that world where you have to you got a Romeo and Juliet. There's an interesting tragedy where, again, you're trying to challenge conventions of parental arrangements of marriage and so on. It ends up tragedy, but not without sympathy, profound sympathy, of course, for the attempt to get away from these constraints of social order. So comparing here how tragedy and comedy deal with that kind of configuration and according to very contrasting patterns.
So David, one thing that you've been saying, and we'll summarize this part of the conversation, is that very powerfully in Shakespeare's plays, but specifically in Hamlet, friendship is represented as it was in the classical world,
yes,
as a relation between two selves.
Yes.
So in the notion that the friend is a second self,
right,
it's really what we are seeing.
Right.
At least the aspiration is that the relation between Hamlet and his friend might be that
right,
kind of relationship.
Right.
It's striking that friendship should be so prominent theme in a play that is, for us, also so powerfully
right,
about Hamlet's self,
yes,
about the his peculiarly modern self. So I wonder if we could use that actually to transition to a couple of questions that have come in.
Good.
And one of them relates to whether we can rely, in fact, on that self, on Hamlet's self, whether we can rely on his perspective, given that he is so confused. Do you see the play working out the problem of whether his position is one we can rely on,
Yeah.
and whether it's one that we must measure against other kinds of positions? Right. Maybe particularly is Horatio's perspective one that fits with Hamlet's, or does it actually offer a different view onto the plot?
Well, let me first of all take a polemical line in defense of the idea that Hamlet's right. I'm thinking particularly of you use the word confused, and I understand, of course, where that's coming from, but I want to qualify it. There's a great tradition which goes all the way back to Coleridge and Goethe and so on, the late 18th, early 19th century, of Hamlet as being indecisive to the point of not being able to make up his mind about what to do. And that's become codified more recently by Freud, who very much offered his theory that Hamlet's suffering from Oedipal conflict and cannot, because he subconsciously wants to possess his mother, cannot, therefore, he fibrillates. He can't do anything about his uncle who's doing the thing that he secretly himself desires to do. Now, I don't think very much of that hypothesis, but although I do, obviously it's a deeply Oedipal situation. But it seems to me that, and there's been some recent work going back and sort of attacking this. Margareta de Grazia has done a wonderful book, I think, about Hamlet without Hamlet, attacking the whole tradition of taking Hamlet out of the pair and putting him on the operating table as if he were sort of specimen to be examined and so on, without considering the importance of action in the play in general. And I think that that's right. The problem is often, from my point of view, with the world, it's a bad fit. Hamlet's a bad fit for the world's a bad fit for Hamlet. He talks about that a good bit. So then when it comes to him trying to make a decision, he does fibrillate, of course. He does go back and forth, but it seems to me for wonderfully understandable reasons. Let me run that through a little bit. His first impulse on seeing his father on the battlements at the end of Act 1, his father says, revenge my foul and most unnatural murder, the son says, haste me to know it, that I with wings as swift as meditation may sweep to my revenge. And that seems decisive enough, doesn't it? That he clearly sees that he has a charge. Now, it is a charge, of course, that is one under the code of revenge rather than Christianity. And that poses a problem because later on he becomes increasingly Christian in his way about thinking about this. But that's partly because he's encountered the difficulty with action. He does puzzle about whether the ghost could be a demon. There's been a lot of discussion, other than the criticism, of course, hasn't there? And I tend to take the view that if you look historically at the situation, there's plenty of evidence. People wrote about that. King James wrote about demons and deplored demonology. That, of course, the ghost could do that sort of thing, and that Hamlet's right to be concerned in his deep melancholy that he might be tempted by, in a susceptible mode, by a ghost that's trying to lead him down a garden path, more than a garden path, a path to the everlasting bonfire. So he comes up with this theory of putting on a play within the play. He consulted with Horatio about that. That seems to work, and they both say, at that point, I take the ghost's word for £1,000. Hamlet goes off, now resolved to do something, to see his mother, and on the way there, he encounters his uncle at prayer, and says, now might I do it? It's often staged with Hamlet standing, this was true at the Globe Theatre production in London recently, for example, standing right behind the kneeling Claudius with a sword posed like this, ready to go ahead and just at the point of stabbing him to death and so on. And then he figures, well, if I did that, I might send him to heaven. Now that, of course, is an irony, since Claudius, we know, Claudius's attempt at prayer is totally unsuccessful. He realizes that he's a sinner and he can't reach up for God. It's just not going to work. But Hamlet gives up that attempt, and then he goes instead to his mother's chambers, having been bidden to come talk to her, be talked to by her. He hears a man's voice, because he's roughed up his mother a bit, and she's more than a little concerned that maybe wilt thou kill me and so murder me? Ho, ho, help, ho. Polonius, of course, who's the one who's hiding behind the arras, quite properly, and a gentleman of action, so help, ho, help, ho. He makes it, he's about to come out and try to rescue the queen, and Hamlet stabs him. Now, what's the Hamlet supposed to do? He's been looking for the perfect opportunity. In fact, he's said on her way to that chamber, I want, after deciding not to kill the king, he says, I need a better occasion than this. I need some moment when the king, Claudius, is in bed with my mother, or drunk, or both, and so on, not when he's at prayer. He goes off to his mother's chambers. There's a man in her chambers, a man's voice. Who else would it be? This is her chamber, private rooms. So he stabs, and then, of course, he immediately sees he's made a big mistake. And he puts it beautifully. He says, heaven hath pleased it so to punish me with this, and this with me, that I must be their scourge and minister. Now, those are wonderful lines that Fredson Bowers has written about very eloquently. Hamlet, to punish me with this and this with me. This with me would mean Polonius got what he deserved for being an old fuddy-dud and a busybody. But heaven, it has pleased heaven to punish me with this. I'm going to have to pay for this in some way. There will be an accounting. This is in Hamlet's increasingly providential view that we see so much in the latter part of the play, that's coming down the pike. He doesn't know how it's going to be. But he says, and then I will be their scourge and minister. And those terms, somewhat related terms, the scourge suggests properly, especially somebody who's a rather flawed person, even a bad man, who's carrying out, unbeknownst, like Richard III, carrying out the will of heaven without realizing that he's doing so. That kind of wonderful, superbly huge cosmic irony. Hamlet wonders about that, if in some ways he's going to be an instrument in his failings, in his just having killed an innocent man, that this is somehow going to be a part of the whole picture. And that's an interesting argument. That's what happens. As a result of this death, Hamlet's about to be exported to England. Well, that's an important part of the story. And then he comes back. It also, of course, lights a fire of revenge under Laertes, who comes back determined to kill the murderer of his father, Polonius. Well, Laertes takes that to be Hamlet. Of course, that's true. So Laertes has an interesting case to make, that this is the man to whom he should, as the revenger, that's another one of these pairings in the play, isn't it, of course, the pairings of Hamlet and Laertes. They're both sons who've lost a father, and they both are commissioned to do something about that. And again, the the example of Laertes points us up the difficulty of action. Laertes sees quite clearly who it was that killed his father. He engages in a plot with Claudius to use poison of two kinds, a poisoned wine and a poisoned sword and so on. And a very ungentlemanly thing for Laertes to do. And he admits that as he's dying, that this was almost against my conscience, he says, as he goes into the duel, because gentlemen don't do that. Unweighted swords, and especially a poisoned sword, that's skulking. But of course, there's a more serious problem, but he doesn't realize that Claudius is the villain and back of all this. So Laertes has made what appears to be a perfectly understandable, forthright movement towards action, and it's been a total disaster from his point of view. And he has to beg, as he does, beg forgiveness of Hamlet, to which Hamlet freely grants. But Hamlet's learned a lot from that too. And then there's Fortinbras, who comes into the play as another person who believes in forthright action. Now that's an ironic one, because Fortinbras, on the whole, is a rather positive image of this. His name, Strong in Arms, suggests the thing to do is to go out like to cut the Gordian knot. And he does rather well. He's about to invade Denmark at the start of the play, because he perceives there is a vacuum, power vacuum. He's talked out of this, or negotiated this, by the very clever Claudius as negotiator and so on, who grants him instead of permission to cross over Denmark out to Poland to go attack Poland and not bother Denmark for a while. And Fortinbras does that. He trains his troops that way. Poor Poland gets torn up and so on, but that's just Poland. Historically, it's also always true of Poland and so on. Hamlet he meets an officer who's in Fortinbras's army and asks him about all this, and he's amazed. He's amazed that somebody would do this kind of thing for an eggshell. The life of 40,000 men for ground that's so poor to try to cultivate that no one would bother to fight over if it weren't for this matter of sort of honor or whatever it is. So Fortinbras is held up by Hamlet as a deeply ironic example, but nevertheless one who gets out and gets done. And at the end of the play, that's one of the greatest puzzles about the play, isn't it? At the end of the play, Fortinbras picks up all the pieces. He's going to be king of Denmark.
Well, and certainly I know you've worked extensively on film adaptations of Hamlet.
Yes, right.
And in Branagh's Hamlet,
right.
The final scene is remarkable for
right,
that,
isn't it?
because
Right.
Fortinbras's troops come in on rope into the main halls.
Breaking through windows.
And so in a sense, that is a reading of the play that suggests that the whole play is an account of how Fortinbras becomes king of Denmark.
He's Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yes, exactly.
So.
David, in what you've just said, and in particular in Hamlet's sense that it might be heaven's will that has made him a scourge,
Right.
It raises a question that another one of our participants has asked,
Right.
which concerns exactly that kind of pattern. How to understand the pattern of revenge that might be that might look simply chaotic. Yeah. So does and this participant notices the thing that everyone notices in the play, which is at the end of the play, everyone is dead,
right,
except Horatio.
Right. And Fortinbras.
But of the two main families, everyone in the family is dead except this one friend.
Hamlet has more blood on his hands than any figure in Shakespeare, right.
So the participant asks whether there are alternative ways for understanding that outcome. Yeah. And in particular, whether there are alternative ways to, let's say, a providential reading of the kind that is suggested when Hamlet says that he might be a scourge, or that this might be, in some ways, he might be an instrument of a will outside of his own will. Does Horatio offer a different view onto the plot from his friend?
Yes, that's a great question, and Horatio certainly does. Let me trace through a little bit what goes through Hamlet's mind about this providentiality. We've already talked about the sense in which he sees himself as punish me with this and this with me, providence, or heaven. Particularly when he comes back from England, he seems to me in a different frame of mind about this, and it's talking, of course, with Horatio, with who else? That he delivers himself of the opinions that there is no special providence in the fall of a sparrow, that if it be not now, yet it will come, if it be not to come, it will be now. The readiness is all. Wonderful speech. And he also talks about recklessness, about praise be, that's not the right word, praise be recklessness for it. We sometimes things turn out when our deep plots do pall. Providence seems to offer a solution. That's very much Hamlet's way of reading his story. Now, one of the great ironies about this, though, is that the play really sets up Christianity versus pagan revenge. Pagan revenge is a perfectly consistent moral ethic. It has its own moral, not one that I like, we like in general, but there's an obligation to kill in return when somebody has killed a member of your family. There's nothing uncomplicated about that. And in fact, in the original story of Hamlet, this is one of the things I look at going back into Saxo Grammaticus centuries before, a Danish saga. The story is perfectly uncomplicated. Hamlet, the Hamlet figure whose name is Hamletus, has an uncle named Fang. Fang does exactly the thing that Claudius does in this play, kills his brother and marries the widow, and the son has the revenge problem. And he goes about it in a cunning way. He uses disguise of madness as a way of throwing his enemy off guard and so on. There's a young woman in the case who's like Ophelia to an extent that he's part of his plot. And eventually, also off to England, but finally he teams up with his mother, who has decided that he's really in the right and so on. With her help, a great kind of net is woven and is thrown over the palace where Fang and his accomplices are getting roaring drunk, and they burn the place down. End of story. That's the ethic of revenge. Now, that would be a very odd ending for a play of Hamlet, wouldn't it? And it's not the one that Hamlet wants. Another way of thinking about this, think about Hamlet as an actor. He loves theater. What sort of role does he want to play? It wouldn't suit well if he were someone who skulkingly stabbed his uncle in the back when the man's at prayer. That's not the Hamlet that we would appreciate. What comes to Hamlet, but it's so contradictory to the ethic of revenge, as he comes back, he senses that somehow, because his father said, "Revenge my foul and most unnatural murder," and the son has said, "Haste me to know it," so on. The end of the play is one in which he decides not to haste me to do it at all. He accepts the will of Providence that will somehow, he trusts, provide something. When he's challenged to a duel, when Osric comes in and says, "The king would like to see you a duel," he's laid some wager on your side and so on. And Hamlet says to his dear, dear friend, he says, "Thou wouldst know well how all is not well about my heart." And Horatio says, "Well, hey, then put it off. You don't have to do this." That's the point at which Hamlet says, "No, if it be not now, yet it will come." He senses that there's something inevitable. There's something appropriate in this. I don't mean to give him a kind of forecasting or foreknowing talent in this sort. I don't think that's it at all. It is a submission to what he takes to be the will of Providence. And then you can interpret the play. He does interpret the play as establishing exactly that. That's what happens. He goes to this duel quite innocently with someone whom he's had trouble with, but he admires the young man. And Hamlet knows that he says, "I've been in continual practice since he went abroad. I shall win to the odds." He, of course, does. He's doing very well in the duel. That's the reason Laertes has to resort to a skulking tactic of wounding him behind his back, as it were, with his poisoned sword in order to be able to get his revenge. So Laertes ends up looking like, and he admits this, like the one who's playing the wrong role. Hamlet, having gone into this without any premeditated view about doing in Claudius, suddenly discovers that Claudius is the villain in back of all this chicanery that's going on, including, of course, the death of Hamlet's mother, who offers a toast to her dear son, disobeying her husband when Claudius says, "Gertrude, do not drink." Well, what's the king to say? He can't say, "Please don't drink that, I poisoned it." But it's quite wonderful. Earlier on, Hamlet has said to his mother, now, in effect, he'd said, "Now, why don't you see a little bit less of your husband. Don't go to bed with him. Try that as a new practice. And especially, please don't tell him that my madness is just a cover. Please lie for me." She does. She lies when the king comes in. She says, "Hamlet hath in madness Polonius slain." Well, she's lying, and then she disobeys him in the last moment of the play. When she says, "Gertrude, do not drink," he says, "My lord, I pray you, my lord, I will. Please pardon me." And she downs the poisoned wine that does the end of her life. Well, Hamlet is there seeing all this, and the king's to blame. In fact, Laertes says it, I think the last thing he says, the king's to blame. Hamlet realizes, as we do, but of course we've known before, Hamlet realizes the depth of the villainy in this plot at this moment. And in that in that moment of rage, but also I think partly of self-defense, he takes out his weapon and sees he has an opportunity to kill Claudius. It's almost unpremeditated.
And it's also true that at that moment
Right.
he fashions a relationship with Laertes.
Right,
He
right,
says,
right.
give me your hand,
Right.
and
They-
he
they-
creates
They exchange pardon.
They exchange pardon.
As he does with his mother, too. He makes up to his mother in those last moments,
Right.
too. But of course, not with Claudius. Now, the other side of your question has to do with Horatio.
Yeah.
And it is when Horatio is left afterwards broken-hearted, agreeing to live on and tell the story of his dear, dear friend, and Fortinbras comes in. He says, well, I will have a story to tell you about purposes mistook fall on the inventors' heads of basically a story of things falling through unexpectedly and of people being undone by their own villainy, which is a very nice way of reading the play of Hamlet. It's also essentially a secular historical view of the story of Hamlet. It has nothing providential in it at all. It's just their friendship is the same as it was before. They still, one thing earlier on that Hamlet says quite wonderful in this regard, he said to his friend when they see the ghost, and I've seen the ghost, he said, there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of, and you're a philosopher, but which he means you scientist people, right? And so nothing's changed that way. The Hamlet, I should qualify that a little bit, but we do hear Horatio saying, "And flights of angels carry thee to thy
Yes,
rest."
that's true.
So, and earlier on, of course, he's agreed that when he saw the ghost, well, I didn't think there were ghosts, but I've seen this. I have to believe that. So Horatio is at least, I shouldn't say at least, he's deeply willing to accept empirical evidence about these things. He has an open, questioning mind. So at the end of the play, he understands where the story has gone, but he wants to read it his own way, not to contradict Hamlet, but because that's his whole impulse as a humanist, as a scholar, as a historian, to see this as a story about purposes mistook fall on the inventors' heads. So to me, that's absolutely wonderful. One of the things that's often said about Shakespeare is that he leaves things so open-ended that way. Not your questions answered here, but your answers questioned here.
Or another way to
right?
put it is that if not wholly open,
Right.
he offers
Yes.
always different ways of understanding the same action.
Right.
So one could say that
Right.
in the two positions that Horatio offers,
Right.
the two perspectives that Horatio offers and Hamlet offers,
right.
you see something like the same thing in Richard III,
Right.
where it could be a
Yes.
story of providential
yes,
design,
right.
or it could simply be a story of politics.
Or both at the same
Or
time.
both at the same time.
Right, it's
And the play
the rabbit and duck.
does
right,
not
right.
want you to choose, but to see that the action is,
Right,
available
right,
for both interpretations.
And that's wonderful for drama, of course. This is compared with some other dramatists, including Ben Jonson, his friend and contemporary, more or less younger contemporary, who's a very great dramatist, but very dogmatic and very doctrinaire about what he wants you to believe about his characters and what the story means and so on, it seems to me. That Shakespeare just avoids that, and it's part of the way in which he never talks about himself. He remains a kind of a mystery that way. And drama is drama. It should be seen as open-ended. Keats, of course, picked that up very beautifully and talks about Shakespeare's negative capability.
Yeah.
At least that's one way of interpreting that puzzling phrase. That a lot of people saw that he's able to do that, and it's to their credit that they saw that he's good at that.
David, we have two further questions from participants, and I'm going to combine them. And they are both about friendship. One participant asks whether Hamlet's ability to sponsor friendships or to make friends or to desire this makes his character more compelling. Is that ability to be a friend or to want to be a friend something that you think becomes that the play wants us to see as essential to him? And that resonates with a second question that's come in, which relates to your work on film adaptation. Is there a version of the play that you've seen on film, but also on stage if there's a more appropriate instance of that? Is there a version where you see friendship being thematized, and specifically the friendship between Horatio and Hamlet being thematized particularly effectively as something that really is not incidental to the play or indeed to Hamlet's character, but absolutely essential to it. So the two questions are, is there a play that makes friendship really come alive for you? Is there a film that really makes the friendship come alive for you? And secondly, are we meant to see this desire or need for friendship as belonging really deeply to who Hamlet is?
Well, I think those two questions do relate very nicely. Thanks you, Braden. Yes, I certainly feel that the friendship is essential to the way I feel about the play, and I think that's invited, for example, in Richard Burton's version, also Olivier's. Burton's is rather hard to get a hold of. You know, he'd done something called electronovision, and with rather handheld cameras, and it's very shaky, and it's grainy. It's technically it's something of a mess. And Burton, in fact, attempted to destroy those copies. He wasn't proud of it, I guess. One survived, it turned up later on, and it's now been reproduced, and so it is available to look at. And the scene in the graveyard when over Yorick's skull and so on is one in which I think we see that Hamlet there's another instance where Hamlet brings forward this wonderful reflection, also a difference, right? The reflection about what death means and so on. The conversation about, he picks up the skull of Yorick and he says, "Does thou think we'll all come to this?" Well, of course, in one sense, Horatio was there as a kind of yes man to hand him the right answers, the right questions too. But then it goes on to, do you suppose we could, since everything turns to dust, could you make some dust coming from the corpse of Alexander and turn it into a bunghole to stop the hole in a beer barrel? Horatio thinks that's a little bit outre, but it's another one of those conversations where they're having a kind of an amiable disagreement about this, but it's over the subject of death, which is the great leveler and so on. And I think both Horatio and Hamlet feel that together, so I think that really pulls them very nicely together. And in the Olivier film, and going back to some older ones here, but there are lots of defects in the Olivier film, but I think this is one of the strengths, that Horatio is really a fine portrayal, a man of his handsome, real integrity. Right from the moment he appears on screen, you can see that he's been cast as someone whom you're supposed to believe in and that Hamlet really can love and trust. So I think a lot of the interpretations have really headed in that direction. Yeah.
So David, we're running out of time.
Right.
I think there's time for one more question, which relates to not to your recent talk in Florida, but to your recent book, Murder Most Foul.
Okay.
And you make the argument there, the large thesis of that book is that the staging, the criticism, the editing of Hamlet, for some reason, has turned out to reflect a much broader cultural history. So listening to Hamlet across 400 years is really like listening to the changes in culture itself. Would you like to end with a few reflections on how it is that this play became so central a document for Western culture?
Oh, thanks, Braden. That's lovely. Yes, it's a kind of a cultural paradigm. One thing one sees, it's true of all Shakespeare's books, especially this one, there are more films of Hamlet than of any other play that he wrote, and lots of good ones, I think, too. And it's wonderful to compare them just to get the same kind of cross-pollinization that we've been talking about. But it's like a cloud that keeps going up as time goes on. It's a little worrisome that there's more and more written and more thought. And there is the element of that's a little bit overwhelming. One can't read everything. One can't suppose that it's all, in fact, necessarily worth reading. But it does attest to something which is perfectly extraordinary. One way of thinking about this is in terms of the recent cultural revolution of the last 20, 25 years. And so beginning roughly 1980, when deconstruction came from France to this country, into Yale University to begin with particularly, and has become so controversial, along with, it's a very cultural moment, isn't it, along with feminism becoming a new set of important gender studies in every way, and the new historicism associated with Stephen Greenblatt and others, especially in California. It was quite a revolutionary moment. And one of the battle cries, of course, was let's do away with dead European white males. And so there's been a lot of casualties that way. Many fewer courses these days about Milton or Ben Jonson or, God save us, Spencer, say, or Shelley. They're not as prominent in the repertory of English departments by far as they used to be. Shakespeare, the opposite direction. He's the great exception to all this. And one way we can put this is all the modern theorists, without exception, it seems to me just about, turn to Shakespeare to ask their questions, deconstructive, feminist, new historical, about Shakespeare's text as using a backdrop, because to me that's a wonderful way of defining what is so truly canonical about him. There was this attempt, and I utterly understand that, to sympathize with it. We should re-examine the canon. Let's don't go on just teaching the same things because we've been teaching the same things. But it's interesting to see the ones that survive. Homer, at least the University of Chicago, is obviously surviving magnificent. Sophocles, Socrates. Among more recent, Shakespeare really stands out as a signal example, and I think it is because he, what I'm suggesting here, taking sort of Matthew Arnold and his idea of you get these perfect models of what it is that constitute this sort of the quintessential, the line of poetry, the great, and with Shakespeare you can say that we can sort of document this or even quantify it by saying that this is open evidence, empirical evidence that Shakespeare provides not answers, but ways of negotiating and ways of thinking about what's going on in these extraordinary texts of his, even the minor ones. I mean, there's been so much wonderful stuff done recently with Titus Andronicus. We had a paper, you and I, just a few days ago about Pericles, an hour and a half long discussion of Pericles, very serious play that many people in the past have dismissed as not worth spending very much time with. But
one thing, David, I think we're going to, we're going to conclude now. But let me just say that this is a wonderful place to end, with the notion that you have just articulated, that one reason Hamlet remains so important as a cultural document and as a document to think with, is not that it has always meant one thing, but really the reverse.
Shows us a picture of ourselves.
For some reason, it is a place that it is a text, and that we are able constantly to reinvent according to the questions that we ask of it. And that is, I think, a very powerful model for how texts of the past become universal.
That's wonderful.
So, David, thank you very much for your conversation.
Thank you, Braden. Wonderful, wonderful to talk. Thank you. Thank you all.
And thank you to all our participants.